They sold her in the parlour at Merritt House, without asking what she thought of being sold. £6,000, her father said through the door, and Charlotte heard the figure echo against the door's brass plate, the way a coin rings on stone. By the time the chaise turned up the long drive at Whitethorn Hall, that figure had become the only number in her head. 6,000. The price of a daughter in spring. She had been told the buyer was a duke. She had also been told the buyer was insane. By the time the carriage rolled to a halt under the dripping yew, she had stopped trying to reconcile the two. The hall, when she stepped down at last, was quieter than any house she had been raised to expect. No footman in livery. No housekeeper on the steps with a curtsy ready. The front door stood half open onto a cold flagged passage and a strip of pale spring light. A man came out of it, not dressed as a duke. Shirt sleeves rolled past the elbows, black ink on the cuffs. He carried a single folded sheet of paper and was reading it as he walked. 3 yards from her trunk, he stopped and looked up, broad-shouldered, no older than 27, with the kind of severe, dark beauty that did not soften when he frowned. He did not bow. "You are 3 days early," he said. "Marriage by license," Charlotte answered. Her voice did not shake. She had practiced that, in the carriage, against the cold pane. "My father wrote that you had it from the bishop already." "Yes." A pause. The frown reached his eyes and stayed there a moment, as if the inconvenience of 3 days were not the inconvenience of her at all, but of his own arithmetic. "Yes, I do. Forgive me. I had hoped to make Whitethorn fit to receive a wife. It is not, currently. Mrs. Pell will see to your trunks. Do you take tea, or would you rather eat first?" She had imagined this man so many ways on the 4 days of road. Drooling in a chair, raving in a back wing, strapped down, naked, pacing. She had imagined being locked in a wing of corridors. She had imagined being struck in the first hour. She had imagined being buried within the month under a different name. She had not imagined a tired man with ink on his cuffs, asking, with grave courtesy, whether she preferred tea or a meal. She was 24, with the dark gold hair and grave grey eyes her mother had once said were wasted on a girl with so little inclination to use them charmingly. She had been told, by a London modiste in passing, that she was the kind of beauty that took an extra glance to see, and a third glance to settle, and her father had not approved of the modiste's tone. The hall on the second look was older than she had registered on the first. Pewter grey stone gave way to a long passage of pale oak that had been waxed perhaps a fortnight ago, and not since. The tall, narrow windows on the south side were curtained in plain, unbleached linen, rather than the heavy velvets one expected at a great house. The curtains, she noted, had been kept clean. There was no smell of dogs. There was no smell of stale wine. The lamp brackets on the wall were set at an unfashionable height, lower than London houses kept them, and each lamp had a small, clean glass chimney, free of the sooting that came of careless trimming. Whoever ran this house, Charlotte thought, did not run it as a duke would. They ran it as a careful tradesman would, who could not afford a single avoidable expense, and did not pretend otherwise. The thought was not an unwelcome one. Her cloak dripped onto the stone behind her in a small, regular pattern. The man who had not bowed was already 3 paces ahead, and waiting. "Tea," she said, because it was the smaller answer, and her hands had begun to tremble in her gloves. He nodded once, the way one nods at a calculation that has settled. "This way." The Duke of Ravenshold did not offer his arm. He held the door and let her go through ahead of him, and did not look at her face as she passed. The corridor smelled of old plaster and a faint, sharp green that took her a moment to identify as boiled willow bark. Her boots clicked on stone the colour of pewter. Somewhere, far off in the house, a child laughed and was hushed. Charlotte Merritt stopped in the middle of the passage, as if she had walked into a wall. "Forgive me," she said. "Was that a child?" The Duke turned. His grey eyes fixed her, not unkindly, but with the measuring stillness of a man unused to being asked questions on this floor. Yes. Whose? My head groom's. He is 6. He is not in the wing where you will sleep. He paused, as if he had heard, just then, what the question might mean. Mrs. Merritt, there are no patients in this house. There are tenants' children in the kitchen garden, and a midwife at present in the dairy, with one of the tenant women. Whatever you have been told about Whitethorn, you will see for yourself by tonight. She did not know what to do with the careful neutrality of his voice, so she only nodded and walked on. The parlour he led her to had clean linen on the chairs and a small fire, but every flat surface, the side table, the writing desk, the windowsill, was covered in books and folded paper and small numbered tags. He swept a stack of folios off the better of the 2 armchairs with the efficiency of a man clearing his own debris. A lined ledger fell open beside her boot. She bent automatically and picked it up. It was a household chemistry account: glass, lye, alcohol of wine, distilled water, sulfate of lime. Tidy columns. At the foot of the 3rd column, beneath a calculation in pencil, someone had divided 84 by 16 and written down 5 1/4. 5 1/4, she said, before she had thought at all. It is 5 1/4 exactly. 84 over 16 is 21 over 4, which is 5 1/4. The figure is correct, but you have forgotten to multiply by the 2nd column at the top, which makes the dose 10 1/2, not 5 1/4. You will be giving each child half what you intended. The room went so completely still, she heard the fire find a new vein in the log. The Duke crossed the parlour in 3 strides, took the ledger from her, and looked at the figure. He looked at it for a long time. He answered at last. His voice had changed. Not warmer, only quieter, and he agreed that he would be. I beg your pardon, Charlotte said, suddenly conscious of the ink on his cuffs and the pencil in his hand, and the fact that she was standing in his parlour in a travelling cloak, soaked at the hem. I do not know what I have just looked at. I should not have spoken. You spoke very precisely. He did not lift his eyes from the page. You read chemistry. I read. Her chin came up. She heard it lift. I have always read. There were books my father did not approve of, and my mother could not be troubled to inspect. The Royal Society proceedings came to my brother, who never opened them. I opened them. A short, dry breath that was nearly a laugh. He raised his eyes to hers, pewter grey, very tired, suddenly attentive. You will take tea, he said, in this room, in 15 minutes. I will, if you permit, return in 20. There is a thing I would like to ask you, but I would like to ask it after you have eaten, not before. What thing? Whether you would do me the very great honour, Mrs. Merritt, of looking at the 2nd column. He bowed, only a slight bow, the kind one gives an equal in a chemist's shop, and left her standing alone with the fire and the ledger, and the rain just beginning, fine and grey, against the parlour glass. She sat down because her knees had stopped supporting her on principle. £6,000, her father had said through a door. She had been ready for many things. She had not been ready for arithmetic. Mrs. Pell was a square Yorkshirewoman, with kind eyes, and the particular stillness of a person who had been instructed to be unsurprised by anything. Tea came with bread and salted butter, and a small dish of preserved cherries, which Charlotte ate without thinking, before she remembered she had not eaten cherries since the spring before her engagement was broken off. The fire mended. The rain settled into a soft patter against the parlour glass. The Duke did not return in 20 minutes. He returned in 2 hours. Charlotte had by then opened the 2nd column of the ledger entirely on her own. Whitethorn Hall, she discovered over the first 3 days, was not a house. It was the disguise of a house. The staterooms on the south front had been shuttered for 2 years, dust sheets thrown over 4 chandeliers in the long dining room. The east wing, where Mrs. Pell installed her, had a new mattress, a new washstand, a small writing desk, a vase of paper whites, and a key on the inside of the door which Charlotte was invited, very quietly, to use whenever she pleased. The west wing, behind a baize-lined door beyond the breakfast room, was where the Duke lived. The kitchen wing fed 11 people each morning and twice that on Sundays, and at 3 in the afternoon, every afternoon without fail, 3 women came to the back door with infants and were taken upstairs to a small, clean room where a midwife and one of the tenant women heated linen. There was no patient. There was no madness. There was a household of working people, and a man who did not sleep, and a locked greenhouse at the end of the kitchen garden, whose windows had been painted black on the inside. In her first 3 days at Whitethorn, she walked alone to the boundary of every wing, every garden, every outbuilding she could enter. She walked in the kitchen garden while a tenant boy of 7 explained, with the gravity of an emissary, the differences between leeks and sea kale. She walked the long beach avenue, where mud sucked at her boots and the rooks came overhead in long, indignant lines. And at the end of it, she stood looking down across the river meadow at 4 lambs, trying to understand the concept of running and not yet succeeding. She wrote, on the second afternoon, a careful inventory of the contents of her travelling trunks, because she was the kind of person who, when frightened, made inventories. She listed the 4 gowns, the 3 pairs of stockings, the 2 pairs of shoes, the small case of pencils her grandmother had given her at 14, the German chemistry monograph she had hidden inside the lining of her travelling cloak, as if it were a contraband, and the single locket containing a curl of her sister Anne's hair. She read the monograph each evening by the fire in the East Wing. She did not write to her family. She had not yet decided what tone she could afford. On the morning of the 4th day, Charlotte sat down at the breakfast table and watched the Duke butter a piece of toast, as a man buttered toast at 4 in the morning who had not yet slept. "You are not insane," she said. He did not look up. He said simply that he was not. "You are letting them say you are." He acknowledged it. "Why?" He did look up at that. The grey eyes had the same exhaustion she had seen on the steps the first afternoon, and beneath it, a small, private amusement that surprised her so much she set her cup down. "Because the other story is more inconvenient to certain people than my madness." He took a precise bite of toast. Madness is a very useful suit of clothes. People stop asking what is in the rooms one keeps closed. And what is in the rooms one keeps closed? "Tea, Mrs. Merritt. There is excellent tea. Have another cup." He went out through the breakfast room door with the same unhurried courtesy that had walked her in. Charlotte sat looking at her teaspoon and discovered, to her annoyance, that she had begun to smile. By the second week, the contradictions had stacked into a tower she could no longer ignore. He spoke German over a folded periodical at supper without realizing he had switched. He read a Latin tract on inoculation in the library armchair, while a tenant's 3-year-old napped against his thigh. He kept a single carved chessnight on his workbench, ivory the size of her thumb, with a small chip taken out of the main, and moved it absently when he was thinking, the way another man might twist a ring. He did not touch her. He did not ask her to do any wifely thing. He sat across from her at meals and asked her the kinds of questions a doctoral examiner asks an able student. How would she ventilate a sealed cellar with damp wool? How would she calculate the volume of a sphere of impure glass? What concentration of wine spirit was sufficient to disable a fungus without disturbing a cell of cowpox lymph? Until she put down her fork one evening and said, very quietly, "If I am being interviewed for a position, you might tell me which one." He looked up. "You will know the position when I have decided whether you can take it." His eyes were perfectly sober and perfectly amused. "I would not insult you by telling you in advance. Eat your soup. It is excellent soup." "You will let me know when?" He gave her the end of the week. It was Tuesday. The pamphlet arrived on Thursday afternoon, in the same pouch as the ordinary post, and Charlotte was the one who opened the bag, because she had been crossing the entrance hall when the rider came. She had begun to cross the entrance hall a great deal in the second week. There was very little else for her to do. The pamphlet had a bad woodcut of a wolfish, leering aristocrat holding a child by the ankle. An inquiry, the headline read, into the continued offences against public order committed in a certain country house in the north, where children of tenant farmers are conducted, on numerous occasions and at irregular hours, into a chamber sealed against air and light, from which some have not been observed to emerge. Charlotte read the pamphlet twice in the entrance hall while the rain dripped off her shawl. She read it a third time on the stairs going up. By the time she reached the breakfast room, she had read it 4 times, and her hands were shaking so badly that she set her cup down before she lifted it. The Duke came in at 5, smelling faintly of wine spirit and a green, herbaceous note she had not yet placed. He stopped in the doorway, looked at her face, and looked at the pamphlet on the table beside her cup. He took it in with a single small sound. "You knew this was coming." "I knew Dr. Vale would publish a 3rd edition. I had not expected him to do it inside a fortnight." "Dr. Vale?" "Lucan Vale, London apothecary. Royal Society associate, regrettably. He sells the unstable cowpox vaccine that fails to keep 5 days at sea. I sell nothing. I give a stable preparation away. Both of these facts annoy him." She stared at him across the breakfast crockery. She said his name. It was the first time she had used his name. He noticed. He answered to it without flinching. "I'm going to ask you a question. I would like the truth." He inclined his head and promised it. "What is in the rooms you keep closed?" He did not answer immediately. He set the wine-spirit-scented bottle down on the side table, took the chair across from hers, and folded his hands on the cloth. "At 8 o'clock tonight," he said, "when the kitchen has gone to bed, and the children are asleep in the cottages, I will take you across the kitchen garden to the building you have been told is a greenhouse. You will see what is in it. You will then make whatever decision about your continued residence in this house seems to you correct, and I will abide by it. I will not ask you to keep what you see from anyone, but if you mean to leave, I will ask you to leave at first light, before the household wakes, and I will provide a chaise." He stood. He had not eaten any of the bread on his plate. He paused at the door and said it would be 8, Mrs. Merritt. She corrected him with the smaller name. He took the correction and repeated the hour with hers in place of the other. He went out. She watched the bread on his plate and did not touch it, and she did not move from the table for an hour. The greenhouse was not a greenhouse. The windows had been painted black on the inside because the work could not bear sunlight. Theodore unlocked the door with a key he had taken off a chain around his neck and stood aside and let her go in first. The interior was a single, long, narrow room. Iron racks lined the walls floor to ceiling, and on every rack, in tidy rows, sat hundreds of small, sealed glass tubes in iron clamps. Each tube had a paper label, a date, a number, a child's first name in close, careful handwriting. A long workbench ran the center, a microscope on a brass stand, 3 oil lamps with green glass shades lit. The smell, sharp, herbal, faintly sweet, was the same wine spirit and crushed greenery she had been smelling on his cuffs for 2 weeks. In one corner, a great slate, 8 feet tall, leaning against the wall. Children's first names in 3 columns. After each name, a neat row of dates. She walked the length of the workbench and stopped at the slate. She asked how many. Her voice was steadier than she had expected. "Last winter, before we began, we lost 2 of 3 children of the village to smallpox. The Pelhams, the Whitcombs, the eldest Weaver girl. None this year." He had not crossed the threshold yet. He stood half in shadow at the door. 43 children in this district have received the preserved lymph since November. None has taken smallpox. 2 have had a small fever. None has been lost. She turned slowly around. He was watching her. "You are doing this without payment." "They are tenants. I do not require my children to pay me to keep them alive." And the colonies? He did not answer that immediately. He came in then, and shut the door behind him, and walked to the workbench, and lifted a single sealed tube from the nearest rack. He held it up against the green lamp. The fluid inside was the colour of weak tea. London supply spoils within 5 days at sea. By the time it reaches Calcutta, or Antigua, or the Cape, it is inert, useful only as a cruelty, because it cannot prevent anything, but persuades the recipient that he has been protected. I have been working on a method of preserving the lymph in vacuum-sealed glass at a controlled temperature for a period of not less than 4 months. I have, as of last Tuesday, succeeded for 107 days. I require, to ship to Calcutta, a stable preparation of 120 days. I have failed at 121 for 14 consecutive trials. The thing that fails is not the lymph. The thing that fails is the buffering medium I use to maintain the molarity of the salt solution within a tolerance that does not destroy the cell wall by osmotic pressure. She had picked up the tube and was turning it in her hand. Calcium chloride at 4%. He confirmed it. You should not be using calcium chloride. He went very still. The same stillness as the parlour, the first afternoon, when she had corrected the sum. He asked the reason, without lifting his head. Because at the temperature you are storing it, calcium chloride will form a hexahydrate at the lower bound of your range and dissociate at the upper, and you are pulling water in and out of the cell wall every diurnal cycle for 120 days. You require a buffer that does not phase change inside your operating range. I would suggest a magnesium sulfate buffer at slightly under 3%, with a controlled addition of glucose. It would be stable. The literature is German. I read it last winter at home, when there was nothing else to read, and it is not yet published in English. The silence between them was so complete, she heard the fluid move in the tube she was holding. He spoke her name, very softly. She heard him without turning. Would you do me the honour of telling me, for the record, why your family sold you to a man they had been informed was insane? The tube was still in her hand. She did not put it down. Because they had been trying for some time to dispose of me, she said. Her voice surprised her with its steadiness. I read what they did not approve of. I corrected my brother's tutor in front of a guest at 12. I refused 2 offers of marriage on grounds my mother considered eccentric. The man I had been engaged to last year took an interest in another lady. He claimed I was incapable of the gentle female arts. And I was returned, in his phrase, like a horse that did not take to the saddle. My mother said another offer would not come. My father said the next one would come from a workhouse if he did not act. They had been informed that you were mad, and that you might dispense with me quickly enough that no one would investigate. I do not believe they hoped you would harm me. I do not believe they hoped you would not. He put both hands flat on the workbench. He looked, for one strange moment, like a man who had been hit somewhere he had not realized was still tender. He said her name once. She answered. Will you stay? On what terms? On any terms you set. She thought about it. 43 children's names on a slate behind her. A glass tube in her hand. Spring rain on the painted black windows. I will not be your wife in name only, she said. I do not mean to imply I demand the other thing tonight, or this month, or until you and I have decided together what we are to each other. I mean only that I will not be a body in a cold wing of this house. I will eat at your table. I will walk in your garden. I will be in this room with you when there is work to be done, and there is work to be done. If you will give me a desk and a microscope of my own, I will solve the buffering problem inside the week, and I will solve the next one, and the next, until your tubes are stable for a year. And I will take credit for it. My name on the proceedings, where the work is published. Equal. He smiled. She had not seen him smile before. It moved in stages, like a man relearning the muscle. He said yes. She required the precise word. He gave her the whole of it. She walked the length of the workbench and stopped at the door. She did not look back at him. Then I will ask Mrs. Pell, she said, for a second pencil and a fresh sheet of paper. We have 120 days to reach, and I do not care to lose another night." She put the tube down on the bench as she went past him. Their hands did not touch. Their hands did not need to. They closed the laboratory door behind them at 20 minutes past 2 in the morning, by the grandfather clock in the breakfast room. He bolted the door from outside, returned the key to the chain at his neck, and walked her back across the kitchen garden under a sky beginning to clear. The hawthorn at the kitchen garden hedge was just opening. Small white flowers, tight as fists, the smell of them faintly bitter and entirely new. The first rooks of the morning had begun to call across the river meadow. Mrs. Pell, who never in her tenure at Whitethorn had been observed asleep, came out of the kitchen in her shawl as they passed, and did not say anything. She nodded. She returned to the kitchen. The gesture meant only that she had been expecting them, and that whatever had been decided at last, she approved. Charlotte realized, in her own east wing room, as she sat down on the edge of her bed, that her hands were faintly trembling. Not from fear now, but from something she had not entirely felt before. She had been claimed by the work. The work had been extraordinarily glad to have her. She solved the buffering problem in 3 days. He bought her own microscope in 5. The bench at the far end of the laboratory became hers, a writing surface with a small window above it that, opened, let in the smell of wet hawthorn from the kitchen garden hedge. Mrs. Pell had a brass nameplate made for it. Charlotte Blackwood, the plate said, though they had not yet been to the church. Charlotte left the plate on her desk and did not correct it. There were some pencils she would let her father lose. What followed was the strangest, sharpest, happiest week of Charlotte's life. She did not yet know it was happiness. She thought it was only competence. She woke before dawn in her own east wing bed, dressed in the simplest of her gowns, took breakfast at the long table, where Theodore was always already seated, with his cuffs ink-stained and his hair improperly combed, and walked across the kitchen garden behind him to the laboratory in any weather. The black-painted glass had been scoured clean on the inside one evening, and replaced with a new, green-tinted treatment that she had suggested would let in working light without permitting sun damage to the lymph. The iron racks she had counted on her first night now carried 6 new tubes a day. Mrs. Pell, who had at first watched Charlotte as one watches a stranger admitted into a careful house, had begun to bring her morning tea to the workbench at 10:30, set it down with unfussed efficiency, and tell her, without looking up, "Don't burn yourself." On the third such morning, Mrs. Pell laid a small embroidered cushion on Charlotte's bench stool. On the fourth, she added a folded shawl. By the fifth, Mrs. Pell was leaving an apple on the corner of the bench at 1:30 each afternoon, and Charlotte had begun to look forward to it, the way a child looks forward to a particular weather of day. A pattern formed. They breakfasted at 7, worked until 2, walked the beach avenue to the upper field at 3 in any weather, because Theodore had been told, by a doctor in Edinburgh whom he respected, that a man of his constitution required 1 hour of moving air a day, or his thoughts would not. Returned to the laboratory after tea. Charlotte read German chemistry to him in the evening because his German was poor, and she enjoyed the small embarrassment of his pronunciation. On the 7th evening, she made fun of his pronunciation directly. He went still. That particular stillness that she had begun to recognize as a man laughing without permission, and then said, in the same dry tone, that he hoped her conversational German was equal to her reading German, because there were 2 correspondents in Heidelberg who would soon need to be answered. "My conversational German is execrable," she said. "I have spoken it aloud to no one." "Then we will be execrable together. It is a great comfort in marriage to share a vice." "You will have to find me other vices." "That, my dear Charlotte, will be no trouble at all." She put the pamphlet into her sleeve and laughed for the first time in months. Whitethorn was not a quiet house. There were always small voices in the kitchen wing. The head groom's 6-year-old, who had taken to following Theodore as if Theodore were a particularly interesting tree, and the dairyman's twin daughters, who were 3 and could not yet be persuaded that the Duke was not their personal property. Bertie, the 6-year-old, came into the laboratory one afternoon with a shoe in one hand and announced, looking only at Charlotte, "He's my Duke." You can have him on Sundays. That is generous of you, Bertie. And I'm having him today, because he said he'd show me a jelly. Theodore, behind her, was already opening the cabinet where the prepared agar was kept. We had agreed Wednesdays, Master Calder. It is Wednesday. It is Tuesday. It is Wednesday, Bertie said, with the unshakable certainty of 6. Mrs. Pell said so when she gave me my apple. Theodore considered this. Mrs. Pell, he said, with great seriousness, is correct. It is Wednesday. Forgive me, I have been working. He looked at Charlotte over Bertie's head. His eyes were entirely warm. You are in trouble, Charlotte said quietly. He will believe you on every point of fact for the rest of his life. That is the Duke's burden. I am only a duchess. I cannot be expected to manage it. You are not a duchess yet, Mrs. Merritt. In Bertie's view, I appear to be one Sunday in 7. That is more than my mother thought I could manage. He smiled, without effort this time, and turned back to the cabinet, and lifted Bertie onto the high stool at the bench. Bertie, with the dignified solemnity of a king receiving an emissary, accepted the explanation of agar gel as the grave duty owed to him by his subjects. By the 3rd week, the first 120-day tube was stable. She watched him cap it and seal it, and write the date on the label with a hand that she noticed, for the first time, was not quite steady. She said it was enough for Calcutta. It is enough for the first vessel. Which sails? He checked the tide table folded on the bench. In 18 days. I will need 300 more tubes. We will need a glass blower. We will need his time. You are about to meet Mr. Halloran of Newcastle. He charges by the hour, and he is irascible. I'm not sure I should subject you to him so early. You would not be subjecting me. I would be subjecting him. He laughed, properly this time, a single sharp sound that seemed to surprise him as it came out. She had not heard him laugh before. She decided she was going to do it again. The ball came on a Friday, 3 weeks after the first stable tube. Lady Ashbury sent the invitation because she could no longer refuse to send one without making a public point of refusing. Theodore accepted because Charlotte said that he would. They will tear pieces off you, he said, as she sealed the reply. They will tear pieces off you. They will not know what to do with me. He said her name in protest. Theodore, sit down a moment. He sat. Let me explain something. They are going to talk regardless. They are going to talk in your house, in their houses, in print, and at all the dinners we will not be invited to. They have been doing it for 2 years. The pamphlet on the 3rd floor of this hall, which I assume you have not read because you do not read those, says that you are removing children from their beds in the night. We have a choice, you and I, about whether to walk into a room and let them see we are upright and sound, with an arm linked, and to give them a different first sentence in the gossip when they open their mouths next morning. That is the entire stake of going to a country dance. Do not invest it with more. He looked at her for a long time. You did not propose this country dance to me, he said. I proposed it to you. She agreed without correction. I am only realizing that you are the strategist. I have always been the strategist. My mother put me in dancing slippers because she could not figure out where else to put me. The dancing slippers wore through. The strategy did not. He spoke her name. She waited. Wear your emerald. How? She said, after a small pause. Do you know I have an emerald? Because Mrs. Pell unpacked your trunks. Because she described one gown in some detail and asked me whether it would be appropriate for the first dinner you would not be hosting. I lied to her and said certainly. I did not know there would be an Ashbury ball. I am, for the first time since you arrived, willing to be lucky. She wore the emerald. Ashbury Park was a long, gilded house with too many mirrors and a chandelier held up by what appeared to be 3 painted putti, and a great deal of optimism. They came in late, by Theodore's timing, late enough that the first wave of arrivals had already begun to settle into card rooms and corners, and the orchestra had finished its tuning. The room turned to look at them, in the slow, complete way a room turns when a thing it has been waiting for arrives. Lady Ashbury, at the head of the staircase, applied a smile she had been keeping on her face for 40 minutes. "Your Grace, Mrs. Forgive me, Your Grace." "Lady Ashbury," Theodore said, and bowed, with a courtesy so exact it was almost a punishment. "My wife, Charlotte. May I present Lady Ashbury?" Charlotte curtsied with the precision her dancing master had drilled into her at 12, and her mother had given up improving at 15. She let her gloved fingers rest, for a fraction of a heartbeat, on the inside of Theodore's wrist, where his shirt cuff met his pulse, and felt his pulse jump. "Lady Ashbury," she said, "the room is beautiful. May I borrow the Duke for one circuit of it? Forgive me. He has not been out of his own library in some months, and he is very nearly afraid to go in alone." A small, real laugh from the woman next to Lady Ashbury, who had not been told to laugh and looked for a moment ashamed of herself. Lady Ashbury's mouth tightened. "By all means." They walked. He inclined his head over hers as they went and murmured, "I am not very nearly afraid." "Lady Ashbury does not know that." He murmured her name into her hair. She inclined her head a fraction in answer. "Did your mother in fact give up improving you?" "At 15, Theodore. Smile at the Honourable Mr. Carstairs. He is staring." The room did not have time to settle into the relief of seeing them speak normally to each other. Lady Caraway, in deep violet silk, came across the polished floor with the tactical certainty of a small frigate, 2 friends in tow as escort. Charlotte recognized her by reputation before she lifted her face, the kind of beauty that had been described in newspapers, the kind of grace that had been engineered, the kind of smile that had caused at least 3 documented duels. "Your Grace," Lady Caraway said, in a voice so carrying that the orchestra paused to hear it. "We have been hoping you would come down among us. There has been some disquiet, quite the most concerning disquiet, about the children of your village. I had not wished to credit it, but the parents of the Pelham boys, and the Whitcomb child, and the eldest Weaver girl, are reported to be in the deepest distress, and I am told by Dr. Vale that none of those children have been seen alive since March." The room hushed. It was a beautiful piece of theatre. Lady Caraway had spaced her sentences for maximum effect, lowered her voice on the word alive, and named 4 families whose names had run in the pamphlet. She knew the Duke would not, in this room, defend himself with the necessary brutality. She knew he had not spoken in public for 2 years. What she did not know was the small reticule on Charlotte's wrist. Charlotte had been holding it lightly. She turned, very slightly, so that Lady Caraway could see her face, and the room could see her face, and she opened the reticule. Out of it came a folded packet of letters, 6 of them, each bearing the seal of a parish minister or a country surgeon, each in a different hand. She unfolded the first and read it aloud. It was the Pelham boys' father, thanking the Duke for the safe vaccination of Tom and Jacob in February, in his own hand, witnessed by the Reverend Mr. Hodge of St. Aldwyn's. She read the second. The Whitcomb mother, signed by Mark, witnessed by Dr. McCallum, the country surgeon, present in this very room. Charlotte looked up. Dr. McCallum, by the orchestra, paled. He nodded. The third letter. The fourth. Charlotte's voice was clear and unhurried, the way a barrister reads a deposition into a record. The room had gone so quiet that the pause between 2 letters contained a single suppressed cough from the supper room and the small hiss of the chandelier candles. By the 5th letter, Lady Caraway had stopped smiling. By the 6th, she had begun to look around for somewhere to put her wine-glass. The 2 women who had come across the room with her were, very subtly, no longer beside her. "Lady Caraway," Charlotte said, refolding the last letter and replacing it in her reticule. "I am told that Dr. Vale's name has been mentioned in connection with the report you have just been so kind as to share. I would not wish him to feel slandered. Is he in the room?" A small pause. Then a man's voice from the orchestra side. "I am here." Doctor. Vale was in his middle 30s, beautifully tailored in dark green, beautifully composed, with the small, private smile of a man unused to being addressed by women in public. He came across the floor with measured, unworried steps. "Mrs. Your Grace," he said, with a bow that managed to imply that he was indulging her. "I am at your service." "Dr. Vale," Charlotte said, "would you be so good as to tell us the dose protocol you used in your batch on Tuesday the 8th of April, distributed via Loans & Sons of Newgate Street?" A flicker. Very small. "The protocol is proprietary, Your Grace. I would not bore the room." "You would not bore me." She opened the reticule again. "I have here a deposition by Mr. Loans the Elder, signed yesterday, witnessed by his son, and by Mr. Halpenny the apothecary, indicating that the batch you sold him on the 8th of April, sold for 16 shillings the dozen, was tested by Mr. Halpenny last week and found to contain no active lymph at all. Mr. Halpenny also found, in the buffering medium, an unusual quantity of common alum. Mr. Halpenny's deposition is also in this packet." She looked at him, and he looked at her, and a small, cold understanding crossed his face. "Have you sold inactive vaccine to Loans & Sons, Dr. Vale? It would explain a number of things. It would explain why the children of Lambeth in March suffered the rate of fatality they did. It would also explain why the published rates of your protection, which we have computed from the Royal Society proceedings, and which I have here, are mathematically incompatible with the dosing regime you have publicly described." He looked, for a moment, like a man attempting to remember the fastest route to a door. These are slanderous." "They are deposed under the King's commission, Doctor." Charlotte's voice did not lift. She did not need it to. The room had given her the silence, and she was using it. "If you find them slanderous, you may pursue the matter at the Court of Common Pleas. Lord Hartley is in the supper-room. I observed him going in with Mr. Carstairs not 8 minutes ago, and I am sure that he would oblige you with the courtesy of an introduction to the relevant clerk. We will, of course, be glad to support you with copies of the depositions, witnessed and sealed, by Tuesday's post." The man who had sold inactive vaccine for 16 shillings the dozen looked, for one slow second, at the Duchess who had, 90 seconds earlier, been described in the pamphlets of his own affiliated press as a scandal of compromised morals, and chose, in 3 full seconds of public silence, to bow and to walk, not run, out of the ballroom. Lady Caraway found her glass. She set it on the wrong table. She turned, and a footman beside her offered her his arm with the impassive correctness of a man who had been waiting his whole career for this duty. The orchestra, after a small, unsure pause, struck up the next country dance. Theodore did not move at all for a moment. Then he turned to Charlotte and bent his head and said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "If you are not too tired, my dear strategist, I would very much like to dance with you." "I am," Charlotte said, "a little tired. You will have to put up with me." That has not yet, in 3 weeks, been a hardship. He led her into the set. The country dance was the simplest in the orchestra's repertoire, a Sir Roger de Coverley, given out by a leader who had clearly chosen it for ease, and the figures left them, each round, returning to one another at the head of the line. The candles overhead had begun to gutter. The chandelier swung on its old chain in the small breeze of so much movement, and the light moved across the room like the light of a ship at anchor in a calm tide. Charlotte felt, in the small bones of her wrists, the precise turning of a country step she had not danced since her engagement 2 years earlier. The room watched them, and watched, and watched, because they had walked in to be ruined, and now there was nothing left to ruin them with. The Honourable Mr. Carstairs, who had earlier stared from the supper-room door, now stood at the punch table beside Lord Hartley, and was, with the small grimace of a man revising his opinion in real time, asking the older man a question. Lord Hartley was nodding. The orchestra began the second figure. She did not see her own face. She saw his, and it was, for the first time since she had known him, the face of a man who had set down a long-carried weight, and who, on setting it down, had been astonished to find that his shoulders still worked. They drove home through a hawthorn night that smelled of wet flowers and fresh rain. The carriage lamps swung on their iron arms. The small, uneven yellow light moved across his glove on the seat between them, and across the polished walnut of the door, and across her own emerald skirt, which had begun to dry from the dance, and to give off the faint, peculiar scent of warmed silk. Outside, the hedgerows came and went, and once a fox crossed a stretch of paler road, and looked up at the noise of horses, with the unhurried curiosity of an animal that had been told, repeatedly, by a tenant farmer, that it was welcome at this gate. Charlotte counted 7 miles by the milestones, and on the 8th, she watched the last lights of the village they were leaving fall away behind them, and on the 9th, the rain returned, and the leather smelled for a moment of summer harness oil and clean, wet wool. Theodore did not speak for the first 6 miles. Then, in the dark of the carriage, he said, "You did not have to fight for me." "I was not fighting for you." "No?" "I was fighting for the work. 43 names on a slate." A pause. The wheels turned twice on stone. "And for you. Mostly for you." He said her name in the dark. She answered with his. "I love you. I have loved you, I think, since the first arithmetic correction. I have not said it because I decided early that I had no right to say it to a woman who was sold to me. I am sorry I waited. I would like, if you will permit me, to start saying it now." She did not answer immediately. Outside the window, a hedgerow flicked past, white with hawthorn in the dark. The lantern of the carriage swung on its iron arm and threw its small, uneven light on his glove on the seat between them. She put her gloved hand on his. He turned his palm up, slowly, and laced his fingers through hers. "I love you," she said. "I knew before tonight. I would tell you when, but I think the sequence is undignified for both of us. I should warn you, for the sake of accuracy, that I will continue to require equal credit on the proceedings, that I have a sister I will eventually want to extract from my mother's house, and that I have been quietly composing my reply to my father for a fortnight, and would like to read it aloud to you tomorrow before I send it." He pressed her gloved fingers a small pressure tighter, and said her name. She affirmed it without speaking. "You may extract anyone you wish. You may require equal credit on anything you wish. Read it to me at breakfast. I am, unfortunately, going to need to ask one further question." She waited for it. "Will you marry me?" "We are married, Theodore." "By license, 3 weeks ago, by a clergyman who looked into the room with one eye closed and pronounced us wed in 7 minutes. I would like, if it is not vain of me, to do it again. With bands, in St. Aldwyn's, with Bertie carrying flowers, and Mrs. Pell weeping in the front pew, and the entire village of Whitethorn standing at the back. With your name spoken twice in the open church." "Theodore," she said, "you are, in your way, a romantic." "It is the worst kept secret in this part of the carriage." "Yes," she said, into the dark. "Yes, I will marry you again. But first, we need to put up the banns this Sunday, and I will need a new gown that Mrs. Pell has been concealing in her sewing room without my permission for the last 10 days. "How do you know that?" "I have eyes in the kitchen wing, Theodore. There is very little in this house I do not know." The carriage came up the drive at Whitethorn at 2 in the morning. The household was asleep. Mrs. Pell had left a single lamp burning in the entrance hall. They went up the staircase with her gloved hand in his, and at the door of the east wing he paused, and lifted her gloved knuckles to his mouth, and waited, and looked at her with the exhausted attention of a man who had decided he would never again look at her with anything else. He bid her until breakfast, with her name. She returned to the parting in the same shape. She closed the door. She did not sleep. In the morning he was at the breakfast table at 6:30, in clean linen, and when she came in, he stood. He had not, in 3 weeks, stood when she came in. He had not, in 3 weeks, needed to. "I thought," he said, "we might walk the kitchen garden first." They walked the kitchen garden first. The shipment to Calcutta sailed 18 days after the ball. Theodore stood on the dock at Liverpool with his hat in his hand and watched the crates loaded. 300 small, sealed glass tubes, each labelled with a number and a date, packed in straw in a copper-lined chest stamped with the seal of Whitethorn. Charlotte stood beside him in her travelling cloak. The wind off the Mersey flattened the hawthorn in the hedges of the dock road. She held a paper in her hand, and when the last crate had been swung into the hold, she gave the paper to Mr. Halloran, the glassblower of Newcastle, who had turned out to be neither irascible nor difficult once Charlotte had explained, with 2 diagrams and a firm look, what the Duke had failed to convey to him over a year of correspondence. 300 more by July, Charlotte said, and another 300 for Antigua by August. We will be at 600 a month by the end of the year. You'll burn me out, Your Grace. I will burn you out at standard wages, Mr. Halloran, and one boy of your choosing trained at our expense in the sealing process. You will be the only glassblower in England who knows how to do this. Mr. Halloran considered this with the small, private smile of a man who had been waiting to be valued, and told her, in his gruff way, that it was acceptable. They had not yet been knighted when the second pamphlet appeared. This one came not from Dr. Vale's press. That press had ceased operating, owing to the unfortunate circumstance of Dr. Vale having taken a long sea voyage to a destination not specified in his last letters, but from a London printer affiliated with the Royal Society, and it was titled simply, "On the Preservation of Inoculative Lymph in Vacuum Glass, communicated by His Grace, the Duke of Ravenshold, and Her Grace Charlotte Blackwood, Duchess of Ravenshold, F.R.S. corresponding." It carried both names equally on the title page. It carried, on page 17, a footnote crediting Mrs. Pell with the original observation that the magnesium sulfate buffer should not be heated above 38 degrees Celsius. An observation Mrs. Pell had made over a tea kettle on a Tuesday afternoon in March, and which Charlotte had insisted, against Theodore's quiet protest, be footnoted. The Royal Society proceedings carried the paper that summer. The King wrote in October. It was a short note. The King's notes were always short. "I am told," it ran, "that Your Grace has, with the conspicuous and unflagging assistance of Your Grace's wife, conferred upon the Crown an instrument of preservation, enabling, by report from the Surgeon General of His Majesty's forces in India, the safe inoculation against the smallpox of upwards of 100,000 persons currently within the colonies, with future provision in train to the same number every 6 months hereafter. We desire the pleasure of conferring such honour upon Your Grace, and upon Her Grace, as the occasion warrants. Lord Liverpool will be in correspondence regarding the formalities. G.R." Theodore read the note twice, set it down on the breakfast table, and pushed it across the cloth to Charlotte without a word. She read it once. She set it down. She picked up her toast. "My father," she said, after a beat, "will write." He agreed that he would. He will be polite, and he will request a visit, and he will mention how good it is to see his daughter so handsomely settled, and he will close with regards to my mother, who he will note has been quite poorly this winter. He asked whether she would answer. She thought about it. She buttered the toast. She watched the light on the kitchen garden hedge through the open window, where 2 of the dairyman's twins were arguing with Bertie over the ownership of a watering can. "I will reply," she said, briefly. "I will not be cold. I will simply not invite him, because I do not wish to. I will sign with both names. I will mention that the Royal Society has been kind." "That is a letter," Theodore said. "I would very much like to read aloud, in the carriage, on the way to the King's investiture." "I will be quite willing for you to read it aloud. I will, however, write it myself." He said her name on a small breath of laughter. she answered with his. He told her it had been his favorite tone of voice in the house since she arrived. The investiture came on a clear morning in late October. The leaves on the great avenue at Whitethorn had turned and dropped, and the kitchen garden hedge stood bare and dark against the soft, pale stone. Charlotte wore a gown of deep peacock blue, with a strand of small pearls Theodore had bought her in Liverpool, at the wharf the day the Calcutta shipment sailed. He wore his oldest coat, at her insistence, with a clean white stock, because she had said the king would only see them once on a public day, and she would not have him pretend to be a man he was not. The king looked at them with mild curiosity, said the prescribed words, applied the sword. Charlotte received her own letters patent at a small lectern set up at the edge of the dais, and the Royal Society's president, a stooped, kind man with very thick spectacles, presented her with the scroll of her corresponding membership. He shook her hand. He shook it twice. He was, she could see, entirely uncomfortable. "Your Grace," he said, "it is quite. We have not had a woman before." "You have had 3, sir," Charlotte said gently. "In the 17th century. I read the proceedings." Quite indeed. Quite." He shook her hand a third time and walked away, and Theodore, behind her, made a small sound of stifled laughter. "You have terrified him." "I terrified him by reading the proceedings. It was kind of him not to faint." He spoke her name without looking up from the leaves on the gravel. She waited. He told her he loved her. She told him he had said it 14 times that day. He warned her of 15. The carriage took them home. They did not speak much. The Crown's letters and the Royal Society's scroll lay folded together on the seat between them. But Charlotte did not look at them. She looked at his profile in the carriage window, against the pale October sky, and at the small chip in the carved chess-knight that he had taken from his workbench at the last minute and put in his coat pocket. For luck, he had said, with the entirely unembarrassed romance of a man who had decided, at last, to be openly fond of his wife in his own carriage. They came up the long drive at Whitethorn at 3. The rain, when it began, was the same fine spring-into-evening drizzle she had walked through on her first day, 6 months earlier. Bertie was waiting on the steps, a bunched bouquet of late asters in his fist, with no recognizable plan for how to deliver them. "You are a knight," he announced, very seriously. "Mrs. Pell told me." "I am a knight," Theodore agreed, equally serious. "Will you be one when you grow up, Master Calder?" "No," Bertie said, with the same dignified solemnity. "I am going to be a glass-blower, Mr. Halloran said." He thrust the asters at Charlotte. "These are for the Duchess, Mrs. Pell said." He thought about it. He nodded once, satisfied. "Good afternoon." He fled. Mrs. Pell was crying in the kitchen wing. She did not pretend she was not. She wept on the Duke's shoulder in the manner of an aunt who had been waiting for a wedding she had given up hoping to see. And then she wept on Charlotte's shoulder for entirely different reasons. And then she went and made tea. By 6, the laboratory was its quiet self again. Theodore at his bench, Charlotte at hers. The carved chess-knight had migrated, as it had begun migrating in the 3rd week, to her bench, where it now sat permanently between her ledger and her microscope. Theodore had not commented on this. He had simply, on the first morning he found it on her side, brought a small enamelled box from his dressing room and set it beside the knight, in case it became cold. It became, of course, the Duchess's chess-knight. Bertie, who was not consulted, accepted this distribution of grand maternal property with the same absolute calm with which he accepted the distribution of Sunday afternoons. The order from Calcutta for 40,000 doses arrived in the post the following Tuesday. Charlotte read it aloud at the breakfast table, while Theodore was reaching for the marmalade. 40,000 doses, he said. "Mr. Halloran of Newcastle is going to require a second boy." "Mr. Halloran of Newcastle is going to require a second hire and a third furnace. I have already written him. I have suggested he ask the city for the lease of the small forge across the lane. I have indicated that we will guarantee the lease for 2 years." By the time the marmalade had reached the Duke's plate, Mrs. Pell had brought the second pot of tea, and the day's first letters had been laid in a neat stack at Charlotte's elbow by John, the head groom, who, having been promoted from groom to understeward in October, on the grounds that the Duke could no longer manage the household receipts, and required, urgently, a man of integrity who could be made to pretend he was a clerk, walked the great central corridor every morning at 7 with the deliberation that Bertie had learned to imitate. The first letter on the stack was from Mr. Halloran, handwritten on the back of a glassblower's bill of lading. The second was a long, careful answer in High German from one of the two correspondents at Heidelberg, who had begun, in his last letter, to refer to her as the Duchess in the laboratory, with what Charlotte, from her reading of his earlier opinions, suspected was real respect. The third was a thin, narrow letter from Anne, her sister, postmarked from Sussex, with the seal of their father not yet broken into. "You have written him without mentioning it." "I have written him at 6 o'clock this morning, while you were still snoring. Forgive me. I will mention the next one." He said her name. She waited. He could not, for a moment, find the end of the sentence. "I am also intending," she said calmly, "to write to my sister tomorrow. I have decided this morning that I will offer her the use of the east wing of this house for as long as she wishes, on the condition that she enroll in the small natural philosophy circle Mrs. Pell is forming with the village schoolmaster. My mother will not approve." "Your mother has not yet approved of any decision you have made in your life, including the decision to be born." "That is unkind. That is also true. We will have my sister by Easter." "We will have your sister by Easter. We will have your sister at her own bench by Whitsun, if I have any judgment of the family taste." Charlotte looked at him over the rim of her cup. "You are smiling." "I have been smiling since approximately April. I have been doing it more openly since October. You will adjust." "I will adjust." She set her cup down and told him she loved him. He answered with her name and the same words. "Pass the marmalade." He passed the marmalade. Outside the breakfast room window, in the kitchen garden, Bertie was building at 6 a small empire of his own. The dairyman's twins were furiously colluding against him. Mrs. Pell, in the doorway, with her arms folded, was umpiring with the impartial firmness of a born stateswoman. The spring rain, a different spring rain 6 months on, the same window, moved gently across the glass. The chestnut on Charlotte's bench was warm in the morning sun. She picked up her pencil and corrected, very quietly, an arithmetic error in his latest column. He saw her do it. He smiled. He did not say anything. He never had to, again. If you have ever been told you were the wrong shape for the room you were born in, too sharp, too curious, too much, and decided one quiet day that the fault was with the room, this story was for you. Tell me in the comments what your first arithmetic correction was, the small competence you stopped hiding. And if you have enjoyed an hour at the fireside, subscribe so the next story finds you.